here at the end of chapter 14, we come to another story about Samson and the foxes. And Madeline, I hate to break it to you, this is not going to go well for the foxes, okay? Those are her favorite animal. So, how do you think that Samson felt when he realized that he's mad at the Philistines, but then he has time to think about the Philistines got the answer from somewhere, and he, I'm sure, realized pretty quickly where they'd gotten the answer. How do you think he felt about his relationship with his new wife? Yeah, kind of spoils the honeymoon when she's betrayed you at the reception, when she's betrayed you to your enemies at the reception. So he was angry, and he did maybe the smartest thing in his entire life up until calling on the Lord at the end. He goes back to his parents' house to cool off. Because sometimes when we don't take the opportunity to cool off, when it presents itself, we do even dumber things. So at the end of chapter 14, he goes back to his father's house to cool off. We don't know how long he was there cooling off, because in the meantime, verse 20 says, Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So the Philistines, gotta love the Philistines, right? Oh, well, he went home, so we're annulling this, and here, you marry him over there. The ink was probably not even dry on the marriage license at that point. So when Samson comes back, he finds that his new father-in-law had given away his wife, as one does, and he said, it's all right, marry her younger sister instead. Because, I don't know, women are interchangeable. I don't know. I don't know what their thinking was, but he felt like he had been swindled again. He felt like he had been cheated all over again. He's getting angry now, thinking that these Philistines are just, they can't be trusted, and in reality they couldn't. So, because he had come back at harvest time, the crops that they needed to eat and to be able to sell and to trade with, the crops are just about ready. And Samson decides on the perfect kind of revenge to take at harvest time. He caught 300 foxes. He gathered them up. He lit their tails on fire. I'm sorry, it's really not funny. I'm just looking at my daughter's reaction. Have I told you this story before? Have you heard it in children's church or Sunday school? Okay. It's not on Netflix or anything. It's not. He set their tails on fire and then turned them loose. Because Samson knew that, these 300 foxes, YouTube is going to be shutting us down on PETA's complaints for hate speech for this. These 300 foxes, he knew you're going to set them loose, and they're going to run all over the place like crazy trying to put themselves out, and they're going to catch everything else on fire. We don't have a lot of foxes running around in the wild here, so it's hard for me to picture. But in my mind, I picture if this had happened in Oklahoma, doing it with squirrels. And, they go everywhere anyway. But that was sort of Samson's thought. They're going to go everywhere. They're going to set everything on fire. He didn't have to go through the whole village setting everything on fire. Just let the foxes do it for him. So as they ran away, they're trying to extinguish themselves. They set fire to the grain in the fields. They set fire to the grain that had already been harvested. They set fire to the vineyards. They set fire to the orchards. They set fire to everything. You name it, they set fire to it. Samson got his revenge, but the Philistines looked at this and said, how could you? You escalated this. All we did was give away your wife. You destroyed our entire, I'll tell my kids, here's the line, and here's you. You've gone way over the line here. That was their reaction to Samson. And so they decided they couldn't really get at Samson, so they would punish his father-in-law, because they said, well, it's your fault he reacted this way by giving away the wife. And so the Philistine mob burned Samson's wife and father-in-law to death. And when Samson heard that the Philistines had murdered his wife, he swore vengeance on them. He tracked down every one of the Philistines who had participated in this. He dismembered them, and he fled to a mountain cave. Again, not a pleasant story, not something the Bible says go out and emulate, but a record of what happened nonetheless. And this is the beginning, really, of Samson fighting back against the Philistines. He was enamored of this Philistine girl, and so his heart was kind of being drawn toward the Philistines because of this girl. And then that was taken away, and then the conflict escalated. And this is, again, I don't believe that God said, "Yeah, do this sinful thing. We'll make that happen." But I know that God knew the way Samson's heart was inclined and knew what was going to happen, and said, "I can use this." And this is how God got. This is how they arrived where God needed Samson to be, or wanted Samson to be, which was angry with the Philistines and ready to fight. Questions or comments on that part of the story?
I was thinking of how, like, even the things that we don't see, like God is using all the different things, whether it's like leadership or whatever, and we're just like, they're making these choices or whatever, that God is using everything behind the scenes. Like, there's nothing that escapes, his knowledge, or like he is involved in all of that.
Right.
Even if we don't see what he's doing, like he knows where the end is.
Yeah.
And where it's going and why it's happening at that point.
Yeah.
Even though we don't know what's happening.
That's
so
true.
He's totally in control.
He is. He is. Yes.
Sort of ironic, poetic justice that the 30 Philistine men threatened Samson's wife, "We will burn you and your father."
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why she complied, and then at the end she wound up seeing her father being burned in.
Yes. Yes. And some of those may have been the same. Some of those may have been the same men. Yeah. One thing I know that Samson goes on to be used of God. But I read these two stories, and I'll tell you, there's nobody that I want to root for in this story. There's no hero here. Anyway, I don't know what the point of that statement was, but I think sometimes we hold Samson up like he was a hero. He did something heroic at the very end. We won't get to that tonight because I'm not going to teach the whole story of Samson like I decided to teach the whole New Testament last week, and we were here for a long time on the Lord's Supper. So we won't get to that this week. But if you know the end of the story, he was heroic in maybe the last 20 minutes of his life, but up till then, it was a pretty mixed bag. All right, staying in Judges chapter 15. One of the more famous events from his life. Things continued to escalate. The Philistine troops retaliated against Samson by raiding some of the communities in Israel, which is weird because they've already retaliated by setting fire to his father-in-law's property. But they decided they needed to up the ante, and so they began to launch raids against the Israelites. And when they questioned the Philistines, because remember, the Philistines were in control of their land. I think there were still Israelite communities. There were maybe still some Israelite armies and militias, but ultimately they answered to the Philistines. And so, you're in charge of us, the Philistines. You're in charge of us. We're paying you. We're doing all the things we're supposed to, and now you're coming and raiding our villages. What's going on here? When the Israelites questioned that, the Philistines said it was payback for what Samson had done. And so the tribe of Judah said, "We don't want trouble with the Philistines," and they sent 3,000 men out to try to find Samson. And they confronted him about the trouble that he had caused. In chapter 15, it says, verse 10, I'm sorry, that's verse 11. Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. So rather than siding with Samson, who was one of their own people, they said, you can't do that to them. Don't you know how it affects us? And his answer was, they started it. Which is debatable. But so they said, we have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines. They were ready to take this judge and hand him over. So when they said they were going to arrest him, Samson said he would go along peacefully if they would promise him one thing. Promise me that you won't kill me yourselves. I'm sure Samson could have dealt with these troops. My guess is, for all his flaws, maybe Samson didn't want to kill other Israelites. And so he said, swear to me, verse 12, that you will not kill me yourselves. So they spoke to him, saying, no, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So they said, we're going to... You notice it says new ropes. So they were going and finding the best bindings that they could, the most secure that they could, because they didn't want any more trouble. The way they're getting out of trouble is getting him to the Philistines. And so they don't want to take a chance of him escaping. And he agrees to go peacefully. They led him to the Philistines, and when they got to where they were going, there were 1,000 angry Philistines who gathered around him. They surrounded him on all sides. But Samson just really wasn't all that interested in being taken prisoner by the Philistines. It says in verse 14, then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. There again we have that phrase, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And then he was able to break through these new ropes like they were just absolutely nothing. It says in verse 15, he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand, and took it. Okay, so again, we've got him doing battle with the Philistines, which is what the Lord wants, but is he doing it the Lord's way? What's he doing wrong here? Rick, you pointed it out earlier. Dead animal. Dead animal, which it says it's the only thing within reach. It was the only thing that was around him, I guess. And so he took it. And it says, and he killed 1,000 men with it. I don't even know how that works. I'm not doubting that absolutely not doubting it. I'm just saying I cannot picture in my mind the scene where he just wades into a group of 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone and kills them all. I can't picture what that even looks like. Then Samson said, verse 16, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. I guess the only explanation there is the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. And so he fought through the Philistine lines until he was free. He was left standing. It says he became very thirsty. I guess that means he worked hard doing it. But it says he cried out to the Lord and said, this is in verse 18, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. He sounds a lot like they did wandering in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. God, you just delivered me from 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Did you really lead me through all that so I could die of thirst? What is it with these people and dying of thirst? I mean, I know it's the desert, but people are living out there, people are fighting, they're camping, they're traveling, they're trading. There's got to be water somewhere. But God split the hollow place, verse 19 says, that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name En Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. And that word, that name in Hakor means spring of the caller. I guess meaning because he called out to God, God heard him and sent the spring there. And so for the next 20 years or so, Samson served as a judge over the people of Israel. I don't know why I said or so. It literally says in verse 20 years. For the next 20 years, he served as a judge over the people of Israel. Now, like I said earlier, that doesn't really mean that there was peace under his judgeship like there were for some of the others. It means he was more like a general in that case. He was leading the resistance against the Philistines. Next week, I plan on taking you into 1 Samuel chapter 4. I know the next chapter here is Samson and Delilah, but before that, we see the Philistines capturing the ark and some other things that finally get fulfilled that God promised earlier on were going to happen. And so we'll talk about that next week. Do y'all have any questions or comments on any of the stuff we studied tonight? Is it different? Does it give you a different picture or a different impression of Samson going through and looking at the Bible stories versus the guy we saw in the flannel graph pictures when we were kids? Because I grew up thinking Samson, great guy, not so much. Why do you think God used him?
To show his power, because Samson also, he wasn't very wise and not very discriminating.
That's a good point.
Because it was temperament, too. He had to come out and all the time. God used him, he was not killing. He doesn't fit the form that we imagine. He did use it.
Yeah. That's a good point. I will say God has a tool for every job, and God uses different people for different jobs. Sometimes God works through the wise, careful person like Gideon. Sometimes God works through the guy who'll just say whatever he needs to say, and doesn't think, just does it. It's true. It's true. Some of the characters, we know that everybody mentioned in this book who walked the face of the earth other than Jesus was flawed, but there's some of the characters, even though we know they were sinners, it doesn't really record their sins. And for others like David and especially Samson, even more, it does. And I wonder if the reason for that is because the flaws were so much more obvious, or if God used it to make a point.
Also shows because he's supposed to be so strong, but even the strong people need God. Like he couldn't do anything without the Spirit of the Lord, because everything required that. He couldn't do anything out of his own strength.
Absolutely. And I just made that connection this week. I knew that his strength was dependent on God. But I guess from growing up hearing these stories, I thought it was just something God gave him, and here you go, and it's yours, and run with it. But I just this week made the connection that a lot of these battles, it says, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. It's not like he was walking around all Schwarzeneggered up all the time, or Chuck Norris. He wasn't Chuck Norris. He just had moments of Chuck Norris when the Holy Spirit came on him. I think Chuck Norris could take Arnold Schwarzenegger, would be my guess. So I'll use that example. What's that?
Like see Chuck Norris with the jawbone.
Yeah. You can see Chuck Norris with the jawbone of a donkey. But yeah, I just made that connection that it points out the Spirit of the Lord came upon him at the beginning of every one of those instances. And that goes to show you too, it doesn't matter how familiar you are with the scriptures. It doesn't matter how many times you've read a story. Every time you come to it, there's something new you're going to notice if you just pay attention. All right, anything else? Anybody else?
Another aspect of it that I appreciate is the fact that we are so revenge-minded, which is a flaw on our part.
Mhm.
The bad Smith and taking anybody seems to take it. Well, those guys got to work on themselves. That, we are not supposed to do that enjoying revenge that much.
Yeah.
But we do. Oh, yeah, it's real common for it. And I see that.
Yeah.
That's revenge.
Yeah, it's true. Revenge.
Cheers.
It's part of our nature to be that way, but it rarely works out well for us. As a matter of fact, Sunday morning, as we're going through this series on some of the words and concepts that have gotten muddled, we're going to talk about justice and what God means by the word justice, because there are so stinking many definitions. I couldn't even fit them in my sermon notes for the week. But one of the things that we'll see, I'm just giving you a teaser, hopefully, with no spoiler alerts. But one of the things we're going to see is that justice and revenge are not the same thing. It's one of the things that God points out in Exodus. So we'll be talking about that Sunday.